pause and let someone. Good day. Thank you for joining us today on this special webcast. This is a conference keynote webcast from the conference board. And what that means is that this is a summary of some really great highlights from the coaching conference that we had recently. So thank you for joining us. I'm Amy Abel. I am the Managing Director for Human Capital here at the Conference Board, and I'm very excited to bring to you this topic and to invite you to join me in this conversation with my special guest, Achieving Corporate Goals Through a More Inclusive Coaching Culture. And again, this is a recap from a coaching conference that we had earlier this year. What do we want to focus on for today's webcast? Evolving trends around coaching practices. Many of you know that coaching practices continue to change and is very dynamic from the research that I'm doing and what I see happening at companies. So today we'll focus and do a little bit deeper dive, our thoughts around team coaching, research around goal-based coaching. How can leaders and teams benefit from team coaching? What is neuroscience of coaching telling us about our practice? What are some implications of these trends of our own coaching to our own coaching work or organizations' practices? Now, I pose some of these questions to start our conversation and to start your thinking, but I also want to invite you to join in on this conversation. You'll notice in your lower left-hand box is a share your questions box. I invite you to join us as we talk through this webcast for the whole webcast to type in your questions. I will take a look at those questions and feed them back to our guests. And we want to involve you in this conversation. Tell us what you're thinking about, asking, and questioning. Those of you that are joining for credits, you can see the type of credits that we have, the HRCI, SHRM, CCE, CPE, and follow the instructions, type in your name and specify the type of credits. We'll be happy to take care of that for you. And thank you again for joining for your credits and your continuing learning. So with that, let me first introduce my guest for today, Professor Richard Boyatzis, who is the Distinguished University Professor at Case Western Reserve University. Many of you may have known and heard of Professor Boyatzis chatting, thought leadership, conversations, webcasts that he might do. He has done many around the topic of coaching. He's got quite a bit of experience, and we're very excited to have him join us in this conversation so we can learn about some recent research and things around coaching that he's been thinking and pondering as it relates to research. I'm also very excited to introduce Stephanie Trotter, who's an executive coach, talent leadership, and OD excellence expert from GlaxoSmithKline for large pharmaceutical. It's great to bring in and do the combination of the practice and research as we combine our thinking and bring our best, hopefully, to the work that we do in coaching. And so this is the combination that I think works, and it's very compassionate for myself because I am a researcher and I like to do and bring in the application of the research to all the work that we do. Oh, so let me go back. So I was going to say, with that, we don't actually need to go to the slides because we are intending this to be a very conversational dialogue between the speakers and myself. And again, I do welcome and invite you to join. And so you can invite and type in your questions in the lower left-hand box. But first, let me turn to Stephanie. And let me ask Stephanie to tell us a little bit about your organization, but tell us also about what's going on in the organization, a little context, if you will. What's going on in the business? What's going on that are changing? Everyone is going through quite a bit of change, but what's the change happening in your organization, in your industry, that is pushing coaching and team coaching in particular? Can you share a little bit of that with us?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, it's great to be here with everybody this afternoon, this morning, this evening. I hope that you're keeping warm if you're in cooler weather, or you're enjoying sunshine if there's lots of warm sunshine where you are. So I work at GSK, which is a multinational pharmaceutical company. We have three main businesses, one in respiratory health. Our consumer business is focused in oral health and respiratory health. And we have a vaccines business, which we have various vaccines to help prevent disease. We have over 100,000 employees that are based worldwide, and we operate in 138 companies or countries. And a few years ago, GSK and the Talent Leadership Center of Excellence decided that we wanted to make sure that everybody had access to coaching, because at the time we were going through a lot of change. And I must say, more recently, we're going through exponential change, which I'm sure a lot of you are facing and seeing in the different work that you do. So about 2 years ago, we had a new CEO named Emma Walmsley. And before she began, she took a step back and she held various listening sessions around the world. And she asked everybody, what is it that we can do at GSK to be better, to serve our patients and consumer better than we have before? And one of the things that really stood out for her is people mentioned how we have a consensus building culture, which on one hand sounds great because everybody is invited and included to conversations. On the other hand, it can be a downside because there isn't one person that's accountable for making sure that we're getting results. And actually, people were saying it was quite frustrating. So Emma took that and other feedback and said, we're going to shift the business model. And we're going to shift the business model so that it's a 3+1 model. The 3 is the 3 individual businesses, pharma, vaccines, and consumer healthcare. And the 1 is the global support function. So teams that are in legal and compliance and regulatory and HR. And what I want to start doing is making sure that the business leaders who lead the 3 different businesses are responsible and accountable for delivering results. What that means for people in the 1 is that you need to work with your leadership teams and put objectives in place that will help those businesses drive results. What that meant is we needed to think about how we worked as a team differently. And the power, the importance of the team became even more important because everybody, even the people in the 1, those functions in the 1, they now needed to contribute to the best thinking, because there's so many interdependencies, the best thinking in order to drive performance results. And what that meant was, in a very practical level, that teams now needed to be one, to be interdependent, to make sure that communication was open, there was a high level of trust, information was flowing, so people could understand the differences of opinion, be able to challenge each other the right way, so that we could make sure that we're delivering the right solutions to patients. And so the context is a shift in the business model. And that shift in the business model required us to think about and be high performance team in a much different way.
And if I can, Stephanie, what I'm hearing from you is it's, of course, you've always had teams in the organization, but perhaps the culture around consensus driven decision making or consensus collaboration was not pushing the envelope as much as you wanted the teams to be. Would that be fair?
You're spot on. You're spot on. In fact, what was happening, and in this new day, the leaders were saying, hey, if we're going to be a high performance team, we need everybody to contribute. So in the past, the global support function leaders would sit in the matrix team meetings, but they might not say much, or they might say something after the meeting, or they might not challenge in the meeting when everybody else was there to have the debate and align towards a common goal. So in this new day, in this new world at GSK, the desire and the vision is to have everybody have an equal voice, to share power, create shared leadership across our team. So everybody can contribute, everybody can be in the discussion, and everybody can help the patients and consumers.
Yeah, no, that's I absolutely relate because I've worked in consensus-driven organizations, so I completely understand. I also understand that that is a pretty dramatic shift, and that's a big culture change that the organization may encounter. So let me ask you, let's dig a little deeper in, how did you go about doing this? How did you go about this change? How did coaching come in? What was done with whom? Those sort of tactical questions. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you were experiencing?
Yeah, it's really interesting, organizational life, because there's leaders that we work with that can see the future. They either anticipate or they want to be pioneers. So they start along a journey before other people do. And probably about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, there were several executive leaders who said, Stephanie, I want to work with a coach and I want to do team coaching. They didn't really know what it was, what to expect, so we co-created it in some cases together. And because I have an OD background, I said, why don't we start with a diagnostic? So the diagnostic was some simple questions around what does the team do really well? What could they do better? We dove into certain aspects of what it takes to be a high-performing team, like communication, conflict management, tapping into diversity of thinking, being clear about decision makers, and interviewed the leaders and some of the stakeholders, so people who weren't necessarily on the team. And then wrote up a report and shared it back with the leader and the team and let them sit back and process it together and say, okay, what do we want to focus on developing, which in most cases was building on their strengths and continuing with that journey of having stronger communication skills. And then some teams wanted to fill those gaps. And the biggest gap that I saw over time, and I've worked with 10 executive teams across the United States and Latin America, a lot of the teams wanted to work on how can we challenge each other? How can we depersonalize having challenging conversations? Because we know rationally that it's to help improve the business results, but it still feels personal. So what I would do is bring in some sessions to different teams and help them learn new and different ways to have conversations with each other, to learn about each other, and to work on real business issues. So it started with the team diagnostic. Then I would bring in some simple frameworks to help them work together differently. And in the moment, as they were working on real business situations using some of the conversational frameworks, press the pause button every so often and give them feedback. Help them notice where they were already starting to use some different behaviors as they work together. Or sometimes I would ask them questions to help them see, okay, maybe this isn't the right way to approach this conversation. How can I do it differently? And have them redo the conversation they were in. Or sometimes it was just simply giving them feedback and challenging them in the moment to say, you said you wanted to challenge more. You're still being polite in the conversation. What do you want to do differently right now in this moment of time in order to challenge each other more and drive business results? So it's been really fascinating to see how it's evolved and how I've been able to co-create it with several of the business leaders that were pioneers in this space.
Was it awkward to begin? I'm sure the teams, they probably never have had this level of coaching facilitation. Did they respond well with the 10 teams that they work with, or did it sort of take some time for them to become accustomed to your presence, if you will?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I would say it depended on the buy-in of the leader. So if the leader did a little bit of work beforehand, was able to get buy-in from the team, was able to create some advocates on the team, then most of the teams were fine with it. Some people were still hesitant, and I would say the hesitancy came from feeling that they were vulnerable and they didn't want to be vulnerable in front of their peers or in front of their boss. But once people saw, and I work with teams 3 to 4 times, so I'm going back a few times. Once they see that it is safe and that in this environment, in this particular session, that it's about learning and experimenting and practice and growing and getting feedback, then they leaned into the team coaching.
No, I imagine that that's just a fascinating process to watch, right? From an OD perspective, I can certainly envision that and see the changing going on within the team itself. And what I was fascinated by, you also said that they realized they were often building on strengths. And actually, in my coaching research, we see a lot of coaching efforts today working on building strengths. Historically, we all know, coaching was a lot of fix-it problems, right? And a poor behavior of an executive or something like that, but definitely not today. And we see a lot more organizations focusing on helping leaders prepare for the future, building on strengths, increasing their strengths, a very future-focused, development focus. But what you're saying now is what I'm finding so intriguing is that you're doing it at a team level, right? So to broaden the horizons of all our attendees and guests on the webcast, which is how do we do that from an individual level, but also scale it to broaden it and touch the team level? So I wondered if you had just a quick thought on that, Stephanie, from an individual to team. Is it really that challenging, different, or you're asking similar questions but just in slightly different contexts, or just a view on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you're asking similar questions in a different context. And as a coach, we have the privilege of being able to sit back and understand the individuals on the team and look at the dynamics that they have among them and the strengths they have individually, and help them see and help the leader see and themselves see how they can leverage those strengths together. So one specific practical example is a lot of teams use strengths finders in our organization and like to do an exercise to understand their strengths finders. And after that happens and they have an awareness about different people's strengths finders, as a coach, as I observe the team working on some of the business opportunities they have, then reminding them to take a step back and tap into the individual strengths. So who on the team has that strength of ideation? And it sounds like the team's stuck right now. Sally, how can you contribute to this to help stimulate the discussion and continue to advance it, or if not accelerate it, to help the team achieve their goals? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And then a very another practical question from the audience. When you're coaching a team, do you do individual coaching with the leader at the same time, or is it just for the team?
I do. So that is part of my contract with the leader, because I believe that leadership development happens in real time. And what better way to learn how to lead a team and to unlock the potential of a team as you're working with a coach? So when I contract with a leader and the team, I contract that I will coach the leader before and after every session that I join. And those coaching sessions are primarily to help the leader think about how does he or she want to show up? What team leadership skills do they want to practice when they're with the team? And how can I observe them in action, coach them in action if I have that permission, and support them as they're learning? I also schedule a session after, and we debrief and we reflect and we talk about what learnings, what did they do really well? What do they want to keep doing next time when they're with the team? But I might not be with the team because I'm there pretty, in concrete times with the team.
Right, right. No, absolutely. I think that just sounds so fascinating, thinking about team dynamics and how you leverage those capabilities from the coaching perspective. So tell me a little bit about the impact the organization or the teams have felt. We're always in the conversation of impact and demonstrating value, if you will, around coaching. And how does your organization view that? And what can you share with us on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a question we constantly ask ourselves. And I have three different teams I've worked with over time. So one team, their presenting opportunity was that they felt like they were escalating everything up to the boss, everything up to the boss, everything up to the boss. And it was a pretty executive team. And the leader was getting frustrated, the team was getting frustrated, and they just knew they wanted to do something differently. So, in coaching the team, they came up with the idea that they wanted to create a team code. And so I facilitated a session with each of them or with them as a collective team to say, what do you expect of each other as peers? As executives who are peers, although you may have different businesses or you lead different functional units, what do you expect of each other? So they came up with a very short list. There were 8 items. And some of the items, to give you a flavor, were, whenever there's an issue, come to me directly. Please don't triangulate, don't give other people feedback, just come to me directly, be direct, give me feedback, and let's talk about it. And as a coach, you always say, okay, this is great. Are they really going to live up to this code? And I have to say, knock on veneer, I'm still hearing stories from people on the team that they go back to and use their team code to work with each other. So that's one example of creating trust, better relationships, and great feedback that they give each other. Another team I worked with, and this is quite interesting because it's in Latin America. The HR business partners said, Stephanie, that I'm working with this team, and the team really wants to confront each other better, but it feels like it's against their culture. They don't know how. So I work with the team over time, help them build relationships, build trust, get to know each other on a different level. And the last call I had with the HR business partner, she said, Stephanie, they're now challenging each other. Now it's time to take it to the next level. So we're trying to figure out what that next level is for the team. But, through that work, they are able to enter into challenging, confront each other, knowing it's for the right reason and it's not personal. And then the last team that I'll mention is around alignment. So I worked with a business unit team, a commercial team, and the leader was just, thinking to herself, how can I get alignment? And we mapped this out. She had 22 different teams that would impact her business in some way, shape, or form. And she didn't always have, nor could she have, direct say on where money was invested or activities that were done because of the regulations in our environment in the pharmaceutical industry. So I worked with her and her leadership team on how do you create alignment? How do you break through the silos? We did a mapping exercise, and again, people gave each other feedback to see how were their functional objectives aligned to the business objectives. Where was it disconnected, and how could they reconnect it? So her team recently went through an audit, and she shared with me that the auditors told her, there's one thing your team is doing very well that we haven't seen in other teams, and that is there's clear alignment. So when she shared that story with me, she said, oh my gosh, Stephanie, that's the work we did with you around alignment. So it came full circle. And we work in businesses, we work with leaders who need to deliver results for the street, for the stock market, for consumers and other stakeholders. And I must say these 3 teams that I mentioned, are all meeting their financial targets over the period of 2 years. So it's great to see that the hard work they're doing together as a team is actually paying off in financial targets, but more importantly, in our business, it's helping patients and consumers around the world.
No, those are terrific stories, and I would certainly encourage you to wrap that up somehow, package that with the financial impact, the patient impact. That's a great impact story, and certainly demonstrating value of some of the great coaching work that you're doing from a team perspective. So I think that's terrific, and I wanted to thank a couple of the audience members for participating and typing in some questions and comments. So please continue to do that as we continue this conversation. And let me just turn it a little bit now. Let me turn to Richard and ask him about some, recent research that he's been doing and pondering and thinking about, and how does it inform our coaching work. So, Richard, if you don't mind, let me start off with asking, a lot of certification process and lots of coaching work focus on goal-based coaching or problem-focused coaching, and this is essential for effective coaching. And what do organizations think about that? What do you think about that? How are they thinking about it? And I guess the question really comes down to, is this helpful, not helpful, useful, not helpful? And what does the research tell us? And what is that work that you've been examining? Can you share a little bit more of your insights with us?
Sure, Amy, thank you. A lot of what I'm about to explain really supports part of what Stephanie's talking about. And let me just shift back a little bit towards pointing out that, in 1967, I got into this field because I was working as an aerospace research scientist at Northrop Norair. Excuse me, I was at MIT, and then working on control systems for interplanetary vehicles. I was blown away by how poorly the managers of these, like entire departments of Sheldon's would help them or not help them. So I went back to MIT to try to study this and ended up working with David Kolb. So in 1967, we did the first research study on helping relationships, and which decades later we now refer to as coaching, but certainly at the time, and then by 1969, it became very clear that we actually were calling it coaching. And in the work that some of us were doing, I was doing as a way to pay my way through my doctoral program at Harvard, but with a lot of companies and nonprofits, and I think I was doing material sessions called coaching in 1969. But in 1970, Dave Kolb and I published a series of papers on our emerging theory, which showed, it was one of the first studies that actually showed by setting specific goals, people increased how far they changed their behavior. So, and what came out of that was what I now refer to as my intentional change theory, which is a multi-level theory of change. It basically says the processes that enable a person, a dyad, a team, an organization, a community, a country, even global processes to have sustained desired change occur through a set of discoveries. Now, one of the things that became very clear by 1970 is, although we were looking at the individual and then the dyads, it became very clear as I started to venture into three things at the same time. One was I was doing therapy and designed a team therapy program, a group therapy program, to help people, especially alcoholics and drug addicts, figure out how to work with their families and their coworkers. Because if you had individual change, it didn't last very long unless the group or the team within which the person worked also moved with them. And that way, Stephanie's work is elemental, because unless you're working at the team level, individual efforts or leadership development doesn't have any sustainability. The third thing that I was also working on began in the mid-70s was on outcome assessment. Is college and graduate school helpful at all? But what had quickly started as we were exploring how to help people change in sustainable ways is change what? And that actually gave rise to the competency movement. So Dave McClellan and I were two of the people most often cited as founders of the competency movement in human resources. We were working out of the research consulting company McBurr that he had founded at Harvard. and Marv Danette's group at Minnesota was doing it with PDI. But as we looked at the competencies, we kept asking the question, well, how are people developing these things or not? Again, back to coaching. What became very clear as we studied the interpersonal process is that, and this was really we started a series of longitudinal studies in 1987 at Case Western Reserve University to try to look at how do you help 25 to 65-year-olds change in sustainable ways. So we were looking at the individual, we were looking at the dyad processes, and we often encouraged and used forms of like peer coaching in groups and teams. And the thing that became very clear is that throughout the 60s, late 60s and 70s that I was involved in this, and even into the early 80s, the whole leadership development, management development field was having paltry success. I mean, the only thing we were really succeeding at was creating an entire consulting industry and getting companies to pay a lot of money, companies and governments, to those of us trying to help them figure out what to do about all this leadership issue or management issue, or how do they increase performance. But what became clear in the first 15 or 20 of these longitudinal studies during the 90s is that preceding any feedback, data-based feedback, had to come something else. Because almost everybody had been doing this change work by giving people data, survey-based data, 360s, assessment centers, doesn't matter what, and then saying, okay, how would you like to change? Well, after you give a person data, it became very clear to many of us that people got defensive. And sometimes they did it mildly, but a lot of times they, were basically on notice. And stress is ever present, and change is stressful by itself. So what started to happen is in the late 80s and early 90s is we started to change around the whole process. Let me leap forward to today, because in 2006, we started a series of fMRI studies. We started a series of hormonal studies around the same time. So now a key element of my intentional change theory is that if you really want to help somebody change in a sustainable way, you want to, what we call, coach with compassion, coach to the positive emotional attractor. And what that means is you want to try to help the individual get into the parasympathetic nervous system, the hormonal state, versus the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is the stress state. And in that stress state, a person is not at their best. They, in fact, are compromised. We now have plenty of data, not just us, but a lot of people doing this, to say that ordinary executives and professionals are so overwhelmed by the degree of stress that they have, annoying stress, not pull your hair out stress, that even performance pressure, that what happens is you get, on the whole, cognitive and perceptual and emotional impairment. We even showed how, this whole task versus relationship split that people have been talking about leadership since the 50s or even before that in small groups and in teams is really an artifact of the fact that we have two major neurological networks that affect us when we work. The task positive network, which helps us to focus, set goals, make decisions, and the default mode network that helps us to be open to new ideas and people and doing the right thing in the sense of moral concerns. Well, again, what we started to realize is that when you coached someone to a problem, they never got out of the negative framing of the situation they were in. And it was like back in the 70s when I was working with alcoholics and drug addicts, if they wanted to maintain sobriety and that was all they wanted to do, I knew they'd be back drinking or using within 6 months. I mean, they needed to maintain sobriety, but they had to do it for a bigger reason than just sobriety. And that's where in 1987 and 88 and 89, we began working with a person's vision. In the earlier theory that Kolb and I had been working on in 67 through 70, we talked about the ideal self, but at the time we thought it was kind of equal with the real self. What I can now say is after 32 years of careful research on this, behavioral research. I mean, we have 39 longitudinal studies showing that we can significantly improve people's emotional and social intelligence behavior, the competencies, that predict effective management, leadership, and professional behavior, effectiveness, innovation, organizational citizenship engagement, etc. We can actually produce what holds at about a 50% improvement in the behavior 7 years after the intervention. But it's all based on the fact that you start with the ideal self. You don't start with the real self. And
So,
people used to
Richard,
think, well, yeah,
I'm sorry, can I just jump in with a
sure.
quick question um, just for my clarification? So what you're saying is because we're pushing the envelope a little bit on goal-based coaching. And what you're
Right.
saying, for example, with an alcoholic, the goal itself of wanting to stop drinking is not sufficient to
That's
change
right.
that behavior, and it has to be bigger in some way.
Yeah,
Are
and
you
let
saying
me
that?
put it in the
Okay.
context of all the executives. I mean, I've been working with CEOs and executives since, like I said, 1969, 68. And it's very clear that if they want to be more effective, more inspirational, generate more engagement, get more performance, and even now doctoral students of mine have shown the degree of innovation in companies is a function of these characteristics. How do they inspire it? How do they open it up? And that's where what we've been discovering is that the human organism and then our relationships, both in dyads and coaching, manager subordinate relationships, leader follower, as well as in teams, as well as in organizations, as well as in communities, and of course countries, can easily be sucked into the negative. And when they're sucked into this negative attractor, they are defensive and their perceptual field of vision narrows. And in the process, they become cognitively compromised. So goal-based coaching is as ineffective as goal-based management and leadership. That every time an organization says, well, let's ramp up the number of goals, let's add a few more metrics to the dashboard as a way to motivate people, what they're understanding is they think they have this fantasy that it's going to help. The research data on the human and in teams and in organizations says it does the opposite. And it's not just my research. There are a whole bunch of other people who have been showing this similar patterns for the last 20, 30 years. The fact is that if you start out with the goal, you never get beyond the goal. You miss things that are outside. So at the organization level, you have what's called competition neglect. Not invented here. That's not the way we do it here. And people miss entire strategic moves. I mean, I worked with a lot of the top executives at Kodak for a number of years in the 80s, and they were so preoccupied with Fuji and Fujifilm that they dissed the entire digital market, and they had the original patents on the first digital cameras in 1974. They don't no longer exist, as we know, and in part that's because they got so focused on certain things that they narrowed their vision and they didn't see what was happening around them. So my fundamental question is, yes, some goals are important, and problems, understanding what a problem is important, but you don't want to start with it, because if you start with it, the human, the person, starts to right away get narrowed in their thinking. And we now have plenty of evidence to show that people's cognitive functioning becomes impaired. And other things start to slow them down, like their immune system gets compromised, and they little by little reduce their impact. So what we began to play with is this, back in the 70s and into the 80s, was this whole issue of the ideal self, the personal vision. Now we have the concrete evidence as to the internal mechanisms. We know that when you ask a person to dream about their big picture, their 15-year dream, their sense of purpose in life, you actually move them into the physiological and neurological state where they can be open to new ideas. And one of the dilemmas of coaching is we're trying to get people to be open to the ideas of how they might change, to be open to the rapport with the coach and others. And very often, by starting with data and data-based feedback, we end up reducing that or narrowing it. So the dilemma right now is those certification processes that claim that if you don't start with the problem as defined by the client, you're not coaching. And they'll say, you get a 0 on the assessment processes if you ask them to, wait a minute, let's come back to that in a minute, but let's start by saying, what do you want out of life in the next 15 years? And that process actually hurts. It compromises progress. It compromises openness.
So, Richard, what I'm hearing you say is helping the person that you're coaching become more open and receiving and
Right.
willing to change before you can go into any achievement of goals or achievement of change or achievement of, so you're not saying we shouldn't have any goals, but it's too narrow to start. And how do we be better coaches by helping our leaders better
That's
receive
exactly
that
right.
messaging?
I mean, it's like if you're a parent and you have some kids and your in-laws right away want to tell you how to dress the kids. Well, one of the problems is, you feel a bit of imperialistic push from them. And what do you do in response is you may or may not cope and say, sure, I'll put more clothes on them. But what you're saying is, mind yourself, and I wish you'd done a better job with me or your, my spouse or partner. So the dilemma is people may make the sounds like they're interested in it, but they're not really. So the dilemma is if you don't start with a bigger picture, a bigger context, you're not going to help the person with the sustainability. See, what I'm worried about is not the honeymoon effect. How does a person act for the 3 days or 3 weeks or 3 months after training or some intervention or even psychotherapy? I'm worried about what do they do a year later, 2 years later, 7 years later. And that's where the research tells us it's the sustainability that's the real challenge. And as you're saying, Amy, it's sustainability about openness. Now, where Stephanie's working is exactly in the zone you need to do that, because unless you're working with the human systems, the teams, the groups that a person lives in and works in, you're not going to have the long-term effect. So part of what we're busy trying to do now that we've got the evidence is to try to develop and evolve mechanisms that people can use at work, at home, with their families, with their administrative teams to try to change this. And one of the dangerous issues is in the speed to be efficient and to try to constrain things. We sometimes get so committed to goals that we hurt ourselves. I mean, one of my former doctoral students, Chris Caves, wrote a whole book on Everest expeditions. And he showed how this one classic adventure consultants group, 22 of them started up going up Everest and 19 died because they refused to listen to the advice from base camp that bad weather patterns were coming in. They had a goal and they wanted to reach that goal. So literally, goals help you motivate activity toward a specific, but in doing so, it narrows your focus. So you miss the things that are going on around you. And what we're saying is that if you want to motivate through coaching, whether you're coaching individuals or teams or whole organizations, you want to build in them the ability to continue to adapt and to be open to new ideas.
Richard, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because a lot of the coaching I do with the leaders is around the questions that they ask during a meeting and how are you listening. So a lot of leaders will ask those closed questions to lead the witness, and it must be this solution that I'm going to put forward in my question. So when I coach leaders, I ask them to open up their questions so they're more powerful and help people see possibilities. So I think that speaks directly to what you were just sharing.
No, and I like that because it really is the power of possibilities, and that the key is, I mean, here's something that a lot of top executives get offended when they hear me say this, but so what? It's, show me a leader who opens a meeting with financials and I'll show you an ineffective leader. I don't even have to qualify it because it's really boring. Now you have to do it. I built and ran 2 consulting companies for 11 years. I bought and sold companies. So I understand why financials are critical, But financials are the measure of how well you're doing. They're not the purpose. There is no organization alive today, anywhere in the world, whose purpose is to make money. But very often making money in those measures, whether you're for-profit, not-for-profit, or government, is a part of how we measure it. So this idea of purpose versus measures ends up being a very important confusion. And very often, the narrowing, I mean, like when somebody says to you, you're wearing that, I mean, that's not really an open question. And when executives do the same thing to people, they're in a setting where people want to be compliant, they want to be nice, so they end up kind of acquiescing a lot, but in the process aren't watching what the competition is doing, aren't thinking about the possibilities. So I would say if we want to open people up to possibilities, we have to, in our interpersonal processes, be able to have the context be the deeper purpose, the real meaning of why are we doing all this.
So
now,
Richard,
without sounding weird, we still have to get to goals and solving problems, but I'm really talking about a sequence issue.
Yes, and I'm completely appreciating that sequence that you're articulating, especially as it relates to the sustainability of change aspect, right? That's the point, is the sequence in what you're talking about has a dramatic impact on the sustainability of the change. But let me challenge this a little bit, because in the coaching research that I see and I do with a lot of organizations, there's no question that there's a lot more systematic efficiency processes going on within the coaching space. Coaching engagements are shorter. Historically they may be longer, but now they're constrained to 6 months, and that's what we're contracted to do. Organizations, of course, want to contract with a coach for a very specific purpose, a specific goal, and it's usually again constrained within some time frames or number of visits or all those sorts of things. So I realize this is a little bit, not entirely, a little bit contradictory, and again, some of the research that you're sharing, and I wondered what your thoughts may be on that.
Amy, the research you're doing is well intended, but it's descriptive.
Yes, absolutely.
You're not talking about what's effective coaching. You're talking about what are people doing. And
that's right.
I'm saying that very often they're doing things that compromise the actual effectiveness, sustainable impact of the coaching. And I run into it all the time. So what's the problem with people trying to do things shorter and quicker? I spent amazing number of years in leading, a lot of hundreds of PhDs that were consultants before I became a professor and started, training a lot of doctoral students and executives in this other setting. But in both settings, what became very clear is that you start working with a client and you say, okay, you want to get sustainable change. We need a 4-week program spread out over a year so we can have action learning assignments and people get feedback and they work with a coach for a year and all this stuff. And somebody from the client comes back and says, well, yeah, that'd be nice, but we can't really take them offline for 4 weeks. And we don't want a program to go that long. We want results right away. So what can you do with 2 continuous weeks? And consultants who are in the business of trying to make money and support their overhead very often and trying to satisfy the client rather than challenge them end up saying, okay, so I've been in that situation where you say, okay, let's try 2 weeks. We start on a Monday and we'll go all the way to a week from the following Friday. And then somebody comes along and says, can't we do this in 5 days, and just work a little bit earlier in the morning and later at night? And then eventually within a few months, somebody's going to say, hey, can we do it in 3 days? This is what I call the suppository theory of development, that we're going to make the development process very, very concentrated and just force it on people. Nowhere in any of that work is anybody asking the really important, true bottom line question: what's effective? Because what they're doing is saying putting people through it is the same as effectiveness. Baloney. That's crazy.
So I don't disagree with you. Absolutely. Just because they had
Good.
a coach does not make them a renowned brand new leader in some way, right? It may be occurring, but it may not be. But how do we fight against that? I mean, that is clearly the trend of
Right.
coaching in companies. And this is, this
Right.
is a pretty big conflict that we all have to deal with.
No, it's true. And in fact, I think that it boils down to asking the question, how do we know what we're trying to do works? And that's where inferential research means you're testing something that can be proved false or true. And that's where we have to do inferential research. It doesn't matter that somebody writes yet another book about how I did coaching at XYZ company, because it's case study based baloney. What we need in the coaching field right now is good inferential research, which is putting to a test. When you coached these people, what percentage of these people significantly changed their effectiveness a year, 2 years, 3 years later? How many of them were seen by their subordinates or followers as generating a lot of engagement versus not? How many innovations did they produce? And I mean, right now it's going under the label of evidence-based coaching or outcome coaching. But I think there are a lot of people who are saying, yes, we need more of this. The problem is it is really tough to do. I mean, I just launched the first ever study of competencies of coaches measured against actual client outcomes. And we're using a more complex set of outcomes, not just client satisfaction. Did you like the coach? Because that's a cognitive dissonance reduction. Well, of course, people are going to like the coach. They spend time with them. So what we're saying is, did the person's vision change over time? Did the person's behavior change over time as seen by others? Forget self-assessment. That's delusional. We know that in the research. And did the quality of their relationships, not just with the coach, with their teams and with others, improve over time? So we actually launched that. But to try to get a lot of coaches to agree to fill all the surveys out, to do the 360s, to get a bunch of their clients to fill it out at the beginning and then a year later, is going to take, I mean, we're not going to have real results for another 2 years. But the folks at ICF, at NBCC, and I've even been in discussions with the folks at WABC now, are all saying, yes, that's what we ultimately want to get to. I mean, but they still send out Delphi technique surveys to say, what are the competencies we need? In my 1982 book, which was a compilation of the competencies as measured against performance in 6 major corporations and 6 major government agencies, I showed that when you ask people what's needed, half of what they come up with is accurate. 25% of what they identify is irrelevant. And if you spend time on it, you're just wasting time. But 25% of what people come up with, the experts and the people doing things they think is really critical, is the opposite to what works. So what you do when you actually do the research is you commit yourself to saying, let's look at the real bottom line of development, which is retained learning. And again, we know from all of the research on training since the 70s that you have to look out more than 3 months because of this honeymoon effect. So what I'd say is, let's watch the research.
Yeah, no,
Yes,
I would agree with that.
I mean, goals are
agree.
important and solving problems are important. I'm not saying that they aren't. But what I'm saying is I'm afraid that we've gotten so measurement crazy that we don't realize that we're engaging a neurological network that closes people's minds to new ideas. And no one is going to sustain the effort it takes to continue being open to change unless they're feeling in a state where they are more energized about the possibilities, not the problems, but the possibilities.
And Richard, if I can add to that, I certainly agree that you've given us a lot to ponder, because looking at the research and telling us how we can come to some real clear answers, if you will, on the impact of true learning, impact of true behavior change, and the sustainability of that is very difficult. And doing the
Yeah.
research around that is very difficult as well.
So
there's
and
no.
let's take an analogy here. The whole field of team building, got a big boost in the late 60s around T groups, and then it went on to self-managing work teams and participant worker teams and all that. But the entire field of team building is huge. And, I mean, there's hardly a manager or professional or executive who hasn't been through a whole bunch of team building workshops. Are they better in teams? Ask Stephanie. She'd say, not really, because here we are 40, 50 years later, and people are still running into the same problems of working in teams. So I'm not saying that all team building doesn't work. Some of it does, but what parts of it work are not the fads of what's the most popular, but trying to ground it in, kind of watching more carefully what's really producing results. And that's where I think those of us who are now turning to and trying to do more of the research have to do it in the context of real change. We can't do it in laboratories or in artificial settings. So all of my research is on 25 to 65-year-olds who are working. And,
Right.
Our new book on coaching that's coming out next summer from Harvard Business School Press is really on helping. How do you help people be more open, as Stephanie said, to the possibilities as the context, for what they're going to look at when they try to improve. And in the long run, I think Stephanie's approach is exactly right. The only thing that's going to be truly sustainable is if we help people improve their interpersonal abilities and their team processes so that they're inevitably all a part of peer coaching groups, even in their administrative units or their project units.
Yes.
I mean, we did a study in pharmaceuticals for a competitor of Glaxo, but 30 years ago, in which we showed by focusing on the drug development team, on the competencies and the team processes, in the follow-ups, we knocked 8 years off of the NDA to FDA approval process, which literally halved the number of years it took once they invented the molecule to get it FDA approved, and that gave that company a huge boost, in keeping the drug under patent protection and therefore profitability.
And that's a great business case for the impact of coaching, right? When you get down to quote unquote the bottom line around that example that you gave. I'm very sad to report that we're really out of time. It's been a very interesting hour listening to some of the practice work that Stephanie is rolling out, hoping, working, pondering, and creating that sustainable change that Richard is telling us that is really the value of coaching and helping individuals sort of open up and be more receptive to that change. And I really appreciated the fact that I think many of us overlook individual change through coaching certainly is helpful, but to sustain that requires the team, the group, and the environment, the ecosystem around that individual. And I think many of us often forget that in coaching work because we're doing one-on-one coaching work. But the team, and that's probably why in a lot of my research, I'm seeing an increased focus on team coaching, group coaching, peer coaching in groups around that sustainability, around that impact from a broader sense. And only because I'm getting the flag for the and out of time, I wanted to invite all of you to our coaching conference coming up next March. You can see the slide and a code for a discount if you enter in the code for the registration on our website. But we have a lot of thought leaders and a lot of executives that ponder a lot of these challenges around coaching, how we do coaching, how we can improve our own coaching work, how we can roll out and broaden the coaching benefits within our organization. So please join us for those conversations, and whether it's at a conference or perhaps in other conferences that we have. So we certainly welcome you to join us for all of that as well. Only because I'm really still pondering these questions. I really appreciate Stephanie and Richard. Thank you so much for your time, for joining me today on this webcast. I think you've given us a lot to think about. There's conflicting information, research that tells us different things that practice are not necessarily embracing. And what can we do with all of that? So I think I would leave that for all of you to ponder on your commutes home today and tomorrow, whenever you have the chance to just ponder about that for your own coaching work. We do have webcast evaluation. We would appreciate if you ask just 2 or 3 quick questions. Please let us know how we are doing on this webcast, and certainly any comments for future webcasts. I'm Amy Abel. Thank you so much for your time, for joining us here at the conference board. Have a great day.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.